Good evening. I'm Sarah Watson. Thank you for joining us for this next installment of the Looking for Lincoln Conversations. Welcome to tonight's show, Sounds of the Underground Railroad featuring Reggie Harris and hosted by folklorist and musician Chris Vallillo. Enjoy as Harris performs the music of the Underground Railroad and discusses the impact of that historic route to freedom. For more information about Looking for Lincoln Conversations, visit the Looking for Lincoln Facebook page. This program, I'm proud to say, is partially funded by a grant from the Illinois Arts Council. It is now my pleasure to introduce Chris Vallillo.
Thank you, Sarah. Friends, welcome to Lincoln Conversations. Tonight, we're going to explore the music of the Underground Railroad with internationally known performer, lecturer, and cultural ambassador, Reggie Harris. A descendant of a black enslaved woman and her white master back in Abraham Lincoln's day, Reggie is a master song leader who performs in the spirit of his mentors, Pete Seeker and Dr. Bernice Johnson Reagan, founder of Sweet Honey in the Rock. We're delighted to have him here with us tonight. Friends, please join me in welcoming Reggie Harris.
Well, thank you, Chris. And it is my pleasure to be with you and with all of you to share this great story of our American legacy, the Underground Railroad.
I'm so glad to have you here. You know, the Underground Railroad is such a fascinating subject. It was this vast tangle of interconnected networks dedicated to liberating African Americans from slavery and shepherding them towards freedom. Now, you're universally recognized as one of the masters of the music that was so important to this music, to this movement. Could you tell me a little bit about what attracted you to this initially?
Well, Chris, you know, so often happens, I fell into this because of an opportunity to get a gig. My partner, Kim, and I were living in Philadelphia, and work was a little scarce. And we heard from the Philadelphia Folk Song Society that there was an opportunity to go into schools if you had some program that could show how music, and particularly folk music, made a difference in history. And we thought about what we might do, and Kim thought about a little program that she heard in the 5th grade, where a man came in and talked about the music of the Underground Railroad and this great movement. And that song opened up a whole opportunity for us. We went into that first group of schools, and we were hooked because the story is so fascinating.
Oh, it really is. I'll tell you what, let's turn the stage over to you and let's hear all about it. Friends, Reggie Harris.
Thank you. I'm going to begin with a few words by the poet Langston Hughes, who said, "Hold fast to dreams, for when dreams die, life is a broken-winged bird that cannot fly. Hold fast to dreams, for when dreams go, life is a barren field frozen with snow. With billowing sails, the tall ships came, bringing men and dreams and women and dreams. Heart to heart, hand to hand, together we began to build this land. Some were free hands seeking a greater freedom. Some were indentured hands hoping to find their freedom. Some were slave hands guarding in their hearts the seed of freedom. But one word was there always, and that word was freedom. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom over me. And before I be a slave, I'd be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. There'll be glory, there'll be glory, there'll be glory over me. And before I be a slave, I'd be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. Yes, before I'd be a slave, I'd be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. Yes, before I'd be a slave, I'd be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free, and be free. And before I'd be a slave, I'd be buried in my grave. Strong words uttered by those who found themselves in bondage. But indeed, their journey had begun in their homeland in Africa. And there, in the many places, the many villages, the many cities, the tribes, either caught by a rival tribe or found and captured by slave traders, they were put on ships and sailed across the ocean on what was called the Middle Passage. And we often think about people who are transported away from their homelands, immigrants, and those who have been captured, as being perhaps blank pages into history. But indeed, no human being is a blank page. From wherever our people come from, they bring with them their history, their culture, and their tradition. And these people of different tribes came here and found themselves being put into bondage in a nation that was founded on the principles of freedom. And indeed, as Thomas Jefferson wrote, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. They found very quickly that there was no equality for them. And yet they had this history, culture, and tradition. And one of those traditions was song. Song that would awaken them in the morning, song that would define their day as they worked and they played and the children learned, songs that they used as worship and songs of celebration. It wasn't long before they began to craft songs out of their experience of slavery, and those songs are called spirituals, the sorrow songs, as Frederick Douglass calls them. And those indeed would begin to be the bedrock for their participation in their own freedom. And often it was on the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad, a network of people of different races, colors, creeds, religions, backgrounds, people who believed that in a nation founded on the principles of freedom, there was no place for slavery. And yet, slavery was supported by the United States government. And it would indeed become a very, very difficult thing to get rid of, considering the fact that it produced so much money and so much wealth. All of our presidents, from George Washington all the way through, would begin to have to deal with this. And we know, of course, that it landed right in the lap of Abraham Lincoln, as he found himself being president of a nation that finally had decided it was so very divided that there would need to be a war to decide this amazing and devastating institution. But before that, people began to work together and collaborate. Now, of course, the enslaved, those who found themselves in bondage, helped themselves. First, they had to acknowledge their situation, and they did that through songs like this. Oh Lord, how come me? Oh Lord, how come me? Oh Lord, how come me? I wish I'd never been born. They took my freedom away. They took my children away. They treat me so mean, Lord. And I wish I never been born. I wish I never been born. They acknowledged the devastation of their situation, but they also knew that their songs didn't have to just acknowledge where they were. The songs could also be aspirational. They could also point them in the direction of finding freedom. Woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom. I woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom. Well, I woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom. Hallelujah, hallelujah, oh, hallelujah. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. Well, this little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine, let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. The songs were both evidence of their devastation and also created out of the hope that they had that one day they would not be in slavery. And that is when, in the early 1800s, the Underground Railroad came into being. They had already been working for their own liberation, but now they found allies, abolitionists, people who believed, for a variety of reasons, that they had to help these people to get out of slavery. And of course, the people in slavery helped themselves. They began to sing songs that they could code and use as songs of faith and songs of freedom. They heard a story when they were in church, which often they were, or when ministers would come around and preach to them, that talked about a man named Moses. And that man named Moses had lived thousands of years before their time. But the story was that he recognized that his people were in slavery. And he decided, well, he was called to help to liberate them. And the people hearing those stories about Moses and the Jews in Egypt said to themselves, my, that story sounds like our story. And so it was only natural that they would begin to think about creating songs that recalled that story and then moved their story forward. Because they said to themselves, who will be our Moses? Now we know that the Underground Railroad, even though it was in many places a very organized effort, a very contextual effort that helped people to create the desire for freedom and then to actually get them on the road, to create houses and places of safety. They called them stations. They called the people who manned those stations conductors and agents. And they followed that idea of having a railroad partly because it hid their activities. The masters, well, they thought that the singing slaves were just singing because they were happy. And indeed, the singing did enliven their spirit, but they were singing also because they were passing messages. Secret codes where they sang one thing and meant something quite different. The masters encouraged them to accept Christianity, and so many of them did. And they would sing a song. Let us break bread together on our knees. Many of you may have sung this song in your churches. Let us break bread together on our knees. When I fall on my knees with my face to the rising sun, Oh Lord, have mercy on me. When I fall on my knees with my face to the rising sun. We learn from our study of that time that quite often when they sang that song, they were not just singing praises to God, they were also singing to create the opportunity for a secret meeting, a meeting away from the eyes and ears of the overseer and the master. When I fall on my knees with my face to the rising sun, they were going to meet early in the morning. And they were going to meet perhaps on the eastern side of the farm or plantation. And they would meet there and they would talk, create community, and plan. They would sing songs to bring their spirits alive. This joy that I have, the world didn't give it to me. Oh, the world didn't give it, so the world can't take it away. Proving to themselves that even though they were in bondage, the master did not have all the power. But they would also sing songs like this. Wade in the water, wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. Now I'm gonna invite you to join me tonight to sing this song of liberation and freedom. It is a song that came again from them looking back in history and looking at those Jews who were in Egypt, who were fleeing from the Egyptian army after they made their escape from Egypt and found themselves facing the Red Sea. And there, trapped between a hard place and another hard place, they sang out to their God, asking for liberation. And the story goes that they were delivered. Well, for those in bondage here in America, in slavery, they were seeking deliverance, but they knew that for the most part, most people would have to escape by themselves. If they were fortunate, they might think that their Moses would come forward. Their Moses would come and rescue them. But Harriet Tubman could only rescue so many. And so most of them had to escape on their own. But singing Wade in the Water reminded them that every day as human beings, we need water to drink. And we need food to eat. It reminded you that when you were near fresh water to get a drink and to maybe catch some fish or an animal who came to the water to drink. It also reminded you that when you came near fresh water or a stream or a river, walk through that water. Because if you walk through the water, those tracking bloodhounds that the slave catchers are using would not be able to pick up your scent. And you're actually leaving no tracks. So I'm going to ask you to sing the call and response phrase. I will do the call. Who were those children all dressed in red? You say, God's going to trouble the water. I know. I'm asking you to sing. Well, I'm a folk performer, so it's in the contract. I have to do it. So take a nice deep breath. Maybe a nice drink of your tasty beverage that you have nearby. And then we're going to sing that verse and that chorus to wade in the water, to remind us of those people who were looking into the future, helping their freedom to become a reality. Who are those children all dressed in red? You say, God's gonna trouble the water. Must be the ones that Moses led. God's gonna trouble the water. Well, who are those children all are dressed in white? I said, God's gonna trouble the water. They must be the ones getting ready to fly. God's gonna trouble the water. You better wade in the water. Wade in the water, children. Wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. Well, who are those children all dressed in blue? You say, God's gonna trouble the water. They must be the ones that made it through. You know you better wade in the water. Wade in the water, children. children wade in the water, God's gonna trouble the water. We know that only about 150,000 to 100,000 people managed to escape on the Underground Railroad. And you might say, well, 150 to 200,000 is quite a great number. But we also know that by the Civil War, there were some 4 million African Americans in slavery. Not all African Americans were slaves, but certainly the vast majority were. And not all of them would escape on the Underground Railroad. Some of them would benefit by the fact that Abraham Lincoln in 1862 decided to give in and introduce Black soldiers to the Union Army. That had been a long conversation. But Abraham Lincoln also was evolving in his perspective on what this nation could be. And so Black soldiers joined the Union Army and fought valiantly. And when the war ended, they were given their freedom and slavery was abolished. We know, of course, that the struggle of injustice and oppression did not end with that abolishment, nor did voting rights, which we are still having a really hard time figuring out in our nation. We live in interesting times. There is no record of my family members who were on a plantation called Hickory Hill. There is no record of any of them escaping on the Underground Railroad. There was one escape in the Hewlett family, but she was recaptured and taken back to that plantation that was owned by Williams Carter Wickham. Williams Carter Wickham, a Confederate general, actually one of Robert E. Lee's right-hand generals. He was a state legislator. He was president of the Chesapeake and Ohio River after the Civil War, and he and his wife, Lucy Penn Taylor Wickham, were also slave owners. They owned over 250 people, and some of those in bondage on their plantation were my family. As a matter of fact, not only were we in bondage, but Williams Carter Wickham had those 6 children with Bib Hanna, one of his slaves, and that union produced a family, the Hewletts. Now, he also had a family with his white wife, Lucy, and those 2 families went forward in history. And so it was that, having sung these songs about the Underground Railroad and celebrated that history, and finding myself in a family that now understood where our family began, I found myself teaching in North Carolina in 2010. I had found out from a relative, Kay Bush Gray, that our family had begun on Hickory Hill. And with that information one afternoon, I decided to share it with a class that I was teaching the songs of the Underground Railroad and talking about the connections, the complicated connections in our nation over the institution of slavery and its forward movement in our nation in segregation and Jim Crow. And I shared that information about being related to the Wickhams. And after that class, one of my students came up and she said, "That is a remarkable story. And you're not going to believe this, but I grew up knowing members of the Wickham family." I said, "Wow, that's incredible." And she said, "Yeah, as a matter of fact, a girl named Lisa Wickham was one of my best friends in high school. And I bet she's part of that family." She then said, this woman, Fran Oates, "I think I'm going to look Lisa up because I'm looking into my family history and I'm collecting stories about my childhood. And Lisa is part of my history. I want to find her and see what she's doing. If I find her, are you interested in talking to her?" And I said, "Sure, that'd be great." I don't know that I meant it, but what were the odds that she would actually find her? And so she and I parted for the week and went on with our lives, and I completely forgot about that conversation until a year later, I got an email from Fran Oates, that student, and she said, "I found Lisa. She's living back in Richmond." And we had a wonderful conversation, and I told her your story. She wants to talk to you. And in that moment, I thought, oh my, history has come forward. I would love to tell you that I took the number that she sent and called the very next day, but I didn't. You see, as we know from our present day and from our study of history, these stories can be complicated and very difficult in conversation. I wasn't sure what I would find. I'm happy to tell you tonight that when I finally made that call, Lisa was up to the challenge. And Lisa invited me to come and stay with her in Richmond. And we had a reunion of the Wickhams and the Hewletts. And in the evening, as we talked, she said, you know, the property was sold out of the family a couple of years ago, but it's still in one piece. And if you have time tomorrow, I would like to take you there. And that's what we did. We got into our cars the next day and we drove out of Richmond. We drove north 25 miles. We came off of the highway. We drove for about 2 miles down a dirt country road and found ourselves in front of that great property. And I will tell you that in that moment, even having studied all of this history, even having sung all those songs, even having a visceral knowledge of what the complications of slavery were then and now, I was not prepared for that moment. I sat in my car for 10 minutes while she waited for me to get out and just looked at that house in the distance. And then I got out and we walked the land for an hour and a half, her showing me, because this was part of her childhood legacy, showing me the different buildings and places, the gardens, and then we stepped onto the house porch. And there we began to encounter each other in a different way. All of a sudden, all in that moment, history came present, as so often it does. We walked for an hour and a half, sometimes finding it difficult to even talk, but we reached our cars at the end and I thanked her for bringing me. I knew that she was distracted and for 2 weeks I could think of nothing else. And so I picked up the phone again. And now it was my turn. Because this was not about the spirituals, this was not about the sorrow songs, this was not about the civil rights movement. As a songwriter, I felt called to write something to talk about our day, the day that Lisa and I embraced as cousins and walked that land. And I knew that I could not tell the story alone, so I called Lisa again and I said, I need you to tell me what you were thinking, what I saw in your eyes that day. And we talked for an hour and a half. And I'm happy to say that the song that came out of it is our song. In the same way that if we acknowledge our history, it's not just Black history or white history, it is our history. Well, the song encompasses the feelings and the thoughts that we had on our day walking the land of Hickory Hill.
Barren fields to the horizon, the ghosts of autumn catch the wind. Memories of those saints and sinners gather round to haunt us once again. Now we're finally here together, standing silent face to face. Secret family undercover, born of shame, saved by hope and grace. Hickory hallowed ground, walking side by side, wondering what we found. Hearts break open wide across the great divide. I can see the questions in your eyes now that we are home again. They celebrate the grand illusion, and they write it up for all to see. But in that mystery of confusion, there lies a truth that might one day set us free. So now our stories come together across these fields of broken dreams, and the blood that binds us all together, oh, is indeed much thicker than it seems. Oh, Hickory Hill, we're on hallowed ground, walking side by side, wondering what we found. Hearts break open wide across the great divide, and you see the questions in my eyes now that we are home again. We are home again. Oh, 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 oh. Hickory Hill, we're on solid ground, standing side by side, wondering what we found. Hearts break open wide across the great divide. Can you hear those demons as they die, now that we are home again?
Oh my Lord, Reggie, that is an amazing piece of work. Now, I heard the song before we did the show, of course, but when you combine it with the story, it just transforms into an incredible piece of work.
Thank you.
I have to ask you, you have this direct tie to slavery in your family, and yet you have made a career of bringing people together. Could you talk a little bit about that issue, of how we can use the mistakes we've made in the past to make a better future for all of us?
Well, that has certainly become a mission for me. And, you know, I've always in my life felt that desire to connect with people. When I found out from my cousin that we came of the union between a master and his slave, it gave me a different kind of signature. I'd already been working at making connections and using music to reach out. But that just sort of put a final stamp on why it was so deeply seated in my heart. And I think it also is part of the legacy that came from those elders that brought me along, that gave me hope. I mentioned growing up in my church and having those elders sing those songs, Wade in the Water and This Joy That I Have, This Little Light of Mine. The central part of the spirituals is that people were identifying that they had a light they could share.
Yeah.
And that light is not just to be shared with people who look like you. And the African American community has been all of these years since our nation's founding, reaching out to say, no, we all could be enjoying this. So I think it's both the songs, it's the elders, it's that knowledge that my history contains English and African blood. And this mission that I'm on is not just about acknowledging one part of my history in the same way that our nation has been built by so many people. Yeah. It's such an astonishing experiment in collaboration and cohesion in community. So I think from that, I had a student in a question and answer the other day ask me, how do you stay so positive? And I said, I don't. But I recognize that on those days, well, it's like sooner or later, someday you have a bad day, Sooner or later, you have to realize that the work of connecting, the work of overcoming racism and justice, and it's hard work. And some days you're just not going to feel up to the task, or you're just not going to feel that your work is doing anything. Yeah. That you see these horrible things, the shooting the other day in Colorado, the shooting in Atlanta. You just think, why is it so hard? But as one of my favorite people, who I heard last year on a legacy broadcast that I was part of, Flonzie Brown Wright, I think she put it perfectly. She's the first Black woman elected to office in Louisiana, actually in Mississippi. Wow. Somebody asked her last year, do you ever just get so discouraged you want to quit? And she's in her 90s, and she's been at this for a long time. And she looked into that camera. She said, honey, I quit this job every night. But in the morning, I wake up and I realize that I told Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and I told John Lewis that I was going to take a vow to work with them. And in the morning, I wake up and I realize I got to put on my shoes and go back to work.
Wow. That's an amazing story. Now, the Black church, you spoke about learning a lot of these songs in the church, and the Black church was a major part of the civil rights movement, organizing Black communities for so many years, but also way back into the days of the Underground Railroad. I've heard stories that these are some of the places where the secret communications would take place in front of, anybody. And, a lot of those songs had the hidden messages in them, like you talked about. Wade in the Water. I love that song. I was singing right there with you, by the way. If nobody else was. And we sound good together, by God. But could you talk a little bit about Wade in the Water and its context with the Underground Railroad?
Well, it was indeed a song of faith and a song of freedom. This was as I've been taught, this was part of the people's legacy from Africa, that their cosmology, their way of worshiping in the world was both secular and spiritual. So they were used to combining those two entities. So when they found themselves having to work to free themselves and free others, songs like Wade in the Water, sometimes, songs like Get On Board, children, children, get on board, children, children. Those songs were proclaiming their faith, but they were also able to drop in those little codes. The gospel trains are coming. I hear it close at hand. I hear those car wheels rumbling and rolling through the land. The masters heard that and they say, oh, they're talking about a fictitious railroad that's going to take them to heaven. No, they're talking about their feet that are going to take them to freedom. And the Black church, of course, was the place where they could sing those songs and they could get that sustenance where after a hard, devastatingly difficult, horrific week, who knows what they saw? But you could come together and sing those songs. The thing that we said when we were growing up was, and this was true of the folks that I grew up with. They would sing those songs, and they'd sing them as slowly as they possibly could. They were in no hurry because they had to allow their wounded souls to revive. And then they would get to those songs that were more up-tempo, you know, free at last, thank God Almighty, we're free at last. You know, over my head, I see freedom in the air. Then, after you revive your soul, you can do what they did in the civil rights movement, would say, okay, so what are we going to do now? Well, this week we're going to have a protest downtown, and I want you all to meet me. And they could plan and they could, you know, strategize. But first, you got to take care of this, and you got to take care of this.
Yeah, and you know, the way that you perform that song is completely different than the way I play. You know, I'm a white folk singer. I sound like a white folk singer. But when you, I'm sorry, but it's true. But when you sing that song, I really hear an entirely different approach to it, a much more spiritual approach to it. And the point you just made about how nobody's in a hurry. Those songs, they flow and they meld. Is that sort of representative of traditional African singing and Black singing in general?
It is. It's a multifaceted approach that it really does come out of the need to address all of the human spirit. Yeah. And you know, I know that in my church growing up, and this is very true of those times in slavery, when you can go back and now hear some of those recordings that that Alan Lomax did, or that several other, you come into the building and your heart is heavy, or you meet in the woods, wherever you are. And in the African village, it was the same way. You come into each other's being and you have to give yourselves time to coalesce, to become of one mind and spirit. So one of the things that our present life is that we think that if we want to be happy, that we have to kind of jump in and sing happy songs. That wasn't their way. Yeah. They want to give themselves time to shed all of that stuff that they're carrying around. So there's one song that I heard on a Harry Belafonte recording that he did, Long Walk to Freedom. And it just begins with this mournful solo voice. Oh, Lord, waiting on you. Oh, Lord, waiting on you. Oh, Lord, waiting on you. Can't do nothing till the Spirit comes. And that song is saying, I'm not ready to be happy yet. I'm not ready to celebrate. I'm not ready to have joy. I'm going to wait for the Spirit to come and invest energy in me so I can let go of the toil, travel of the world. Sooner we'll be done with the troubles of the world. You know, and then once you hear those voices, and I can still hear those feet on the floor. I used to ask my mother if I could go to the bathroom because I wanted to get out of the pew. And so I'd go downstairs. She would kind of look at me and say, you better come back up here. And I would go to the bathroom, was downstairs. Well, I'm so glad I did, because I would go downstairs and you got about 100, 150 people in upstairs, and they're singing, and you hear those voices, but you hear those feet on the floor, you hear them tapping on it. You just hear them allowing the music to take them over. And then before long, the cadences pick up. And, and then you hear the joy begin to enter. And now collectively, we infuse each other with joy. So by the time you're ready to leave, which of course in those days was about 2.5 hours later, by the time you're ready to leave, you have been given this gift of a new attitude that you can take into this week. And or maybe take out on the picket line, or maybe go out and support, Rosa Parks and those with the bus program. That is where the approach came from, and that is what it did.
Yeah. I'm just going to take just a second to mention we're having a little audio glitch happening, so you might check to make sure that there's no issues on your end. And while we're doing that, I want to remind our audience that you are welcome to send some questions via the chat. And I'll touch bases and ask those with Reggie right as soon as they come in. Let's see if we've got clear audio yet. Okay. All right. Well, we're going to give Evan and Reggie a moment to see if we can straighten that out. And while we're doing that, I will remind you that we are being brought to you through the courtesy of the Illinois Arts Council, and we are very grateful for their support. No, we aren't. I'll tell you what I would like to try, if you don't mind. Could you guys reboot and come back in? And I'll talk to the audience while you do that. Okay. So Reggie is going to reboot the computer. We're going to try to get a stronger connection and get back to some questions and answers. I just have to say how impressed I have been with this presentation. The depth of knowledge that he's got and the personal connections really seem to make this come alive. And it's a subject which I've been fascinated with for a long time. You know, we spoke briefly about Wade in the Water, and that's a song that I have done myself and have heard was associated with Harriet Tubman as a code song. It was a song that might be used to alert them to the fact, the slaves, that Harriet was in the area and was ready to take them to freedom. But it also had information that they could travel through waterways to keep the dogs from following them. Hey, Reggie, there you are. How are we doing? Well, we have no sound now.
Oh, we still have no sound.
Oh, there it is. It just kicked in.
There we're better. We're good.
Great.
Thank you,
right.
Evan. Thank you, Evan.
Thanks, Evan. I was just saying a little bit about how Wade in the Water had some coded information in it about how slaves could travel through waterways. Yep. I've also heard Harriet Tubman use that song to alert communities she was in the area. And
she did.
Yeah.
She used that song, and she had another song that she used to sing that the melody was lost, but the words said, "Dark and thorny was the pathway where the sinner makes his way, but beyond this veil of sorrow lies the fields of endless day. Jesus, Jesus will go with you. He will lead you to his throne. He alone can guide you. Trod the winepress all alone." She would use that. She would use Wade in the Water. It's also rumored that she would often use Steal Away to Jesus.
I have heard that as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, it's just amazing to me that these songs can be such a powerful connecting force, you know, to bring people together and yet share surprisingly detailed information. Because one of the things I recently read, a book on the Underground Railroad in Illinois mentioned that the slaves were the Underground Railroad. It wasn't a physical thing, of course, but they had to literally go out on their own frequently with no information about escape routes or very limited information, and only hope to potentially find some people to help them along the way.
I can't imagine, you know, we have had some people to recreate, you know, some of the journeys and, but to think about the lack of resources that they had, you know, they did have the ability, unlike most of us, to use nature to their advantage.
Yes.
But then again, even if you're using nature, you're still at the mercy of, you know, slave catchers and people who might turn you in. Mm-hmm. So
I heard the story, and I don't know how factual this is, but I have heard the story behind Follow the Drinking Gourd. Mm-hmm. That where it specifically lays out fairly detailed instructions about how to head north on the Tombigbee River. You know, you come to the headwaters, you cross a hill, there's another river, the Tennessee, you follow the Tennessee to the Ohio. That's incredibly complicated information, and they're sharing this in these coded songs.
Yeah, there's been some scholarship recently that has actually traced that song to Lee Hayes, believe it or not.
I heard that he is responsible for the melody and the chorus.
And
thought that maybe
we're not sure. Yeah, we're not sure where exactly he got the information about the connections, and that's the problem with so many of these songs, is that they come from a very oral tradition, And as you know, trying to chase down, the logistics of oral, traditional oral information, it's like,
And I sort of look at this as a couple of ways. I recognize that the version that we know now is certainly not historically accurate. But I think it's a reasonable representation of the realities that would have happened.
It is.
So you have to kind of, it's like telling a good story. There's a point to which you use the storytelling for the benefit of engaging your audience, and keep the facts in there as well.
As someone once said to me, and I'm sure you've heard this, don't let the facts get in the way of a good story.
I've used that line myself.
Oh, yeah.
I've got a question here. Someone would like to know, and this is a fairly personal one, I'll tell you right out. Reggie, what were you feeling as you sat in that car before you walked on Hickory Hill?
I felt paralyzed, actually. I had been partially down that road about 10 years earlier because the church at the beginning of the road was on the property of Hickory Hill, and William Carter Wickham had given that land to the slave community to build a church and a school. My aunt and uncle had gone to that school years before when they had been sent south. But so we passed the church and we start down the road, and Lisa didn't tell me exactly how far back it was, but we drove for about 2 miles and then came around a bend, and literally when we stopped at the point where we had to stop our cars, the ground, the land opened up and the house was sitting about 75 yards in front of me, and the land was so energetic that it was almost as if I could feel the ghosts.
Yeah.
And so I tried to get out of the car and I couldn't. I just sat and I looked at the house and I looked at the land, and I had to wait until my spirit calmed down and cleared to be able to face it. And I was really grateful. I had 2 friends with me who had been part of a conference, and Lisa was outside of the car. My friends, a beautiful sister duo, Janice and Hope Johnson, 2 ministers, they sat in silence with me, and they said nothing. And they allowed me to take in the moment. And then I got out of the car, and there was Lisa. And here was this white cousin that I have just met, the night before. And she looked at me and she just said, are you ready to go? And I said, no, but let's go anyway.
Yeah.
And that was the day. It was a day of coming face to face with the reality of this complex history. But at the same time, I just felt, I felt very powerfully that I'd come home.
Yeah, I can only imagine that the fact that you are there with a cousin you never knew, and you're both tied to this place. It is so representative of the American story, and the story that I believe it's time to be telling.
Yeah.
Hey, we've got a question from a 5-year-old, and I'm delighted whenever we have kids get involved. He would like to know, what is your favorite song?
Well, as you might imagine, my favorite song is Wade in the Water. I have sung that song probably 10,000 times.
Yeah.
And I never, ever, ever tire of singing it.
Yeah, it's a very powerful song. I performed the version that was, civil rightsized, if you will. So they changed the words to reflect,
Right.
But no matter what, the song has this churning, powerful rhythm to it. And it is a song, I agree with you. You don't want to do that fast. You want that song to flow like a river. And
I know this will resonate with you, but I do that song in 2 of my presentations. And so I do for young audiences, elementary school, and I do it for middle school. But, middle school and high school, the students are getting a little hip,
Yeah.
And if you say, sing along with me, they're kind of like, oh, yeah, right. But I tell you, Wade in the Water gets them every time.
All right. That's
I
good to
saved
know.
I saved that moment and I ramp into it. And before I know, they can't control themselves. You see them start to, get a little motion in.
Yep.
It's a
Yeah, and
secret
high school
weapon.
audiences, they're tough.
Don't you know it?
Somebody would like to know, what were the images you saw as you walked around the property? I mean, were you looking at literally the spaces and places that your family lived, worked?
Yeah, we came onto the property, and the house, as I said, was about 75 yards back. So the road actually went around to the back, which is something I understand they did in those days. It was back from the road, and it went around to the back. So the front of the house was actually around to the back, into the trees, which I imagine, during the summer would be a lot cooler. So we walked around, and we passed a building right to the right. It was a smaller building, and Lisa said to me, "Oh, that was the office of the plantation." And in that moment, we had a very different thought, because I immediately thought, oh, yeah, that would be where they kept all the records and did the business of buying people. She was thinking about the organization of the property and, the history and the record keeping. And we later got to compare notes on that, and she said, "Oh, of course, I would never have thought of that." So we went around to the back, and then we approached the porch, and we went up on the porch, and the person who had bought the house was already renovating it, but they were taking forever. So some of the old furbishings were still in, and Lisa then became just enamored. She hadn't been there in a couple of years, and she was peering in, and then she started pointing out some things. There was a couch in there that had been there the last time she and her family visited. There were some curtains that were still up. We went over, there was a well that, at least the wellhead was still there, and we looked at that. And then we went into the gardens, which were now in disarray. So yeah, I was interested in trying to find perhaps where there might have been slave quarters, but she said they used to ask when they were young if there were slave quarters, and her great-grandfather said, "We didn't own slaves." And she said, "We knew he was lying."
Yeah, that's interesting.
But the images, it was a very surreal day, and just trying to imagine bodies, people walking. I won't say that I saw people, but the energy of the place was still very much present. And standing in the garden, we took some pictures, and we took a picture of ourselves there. And I was just really grateful for this woman. And now, of course, I'm in relationship with her older sister Wallace and her brother George, and his boys Clayton and Will. It's now a real family connection. Now when we talk, we're not always talking about our historical connection, we're just talking about our lives. And this, I think, is the thing that you were talking about of moving forward. That once we face the history and we face the difficulty, now we can see each other as people.
Yeah. And the thing that really struck me about one of the things you just said was her vision of the office being managing the crops, your vision of the office being buying and selling of your ancestors. Yeah. And the blending of those two understandings is the moment when we are reaching that oneness together. We've got another question here. As someone who studied the history of the art form, do you see African American traditions being, and historically, of course this has happened, being taken and used without crediting the sources, even today?
Oh yeah, it's been a long-standing thing with songwriters, musicians, artists, dance, and the conversation, around appropriation. Not only with African, but with all kinds of cultures, has I think risen in awareness. As you well know, our industry, music, and will take and borrow and steal anything that makes a buck. But I think with present day awareness, in the early years, the 30s, 40s, and then particularly in the 50s and 60s, there were so many blues artists and R&B artists and people who just had their stuff ripped off. I'm pleased to say that that kind of conversation and that kind of responsibility, accountability, has been called out, and people are more aware that they need to attribute and they need to celebrate from the perspective. And certain things you just really need to leave alone. A couple of years ago, one of my Native American friends put out a post on Facebook, actually, because there was a proliferation of storytellers taking Native stories and just telling them carte blanche. And he pointed out two things. One, that first of all, many of these stories are not supposed to be told outside of the village, outside of the tribe. And also, many of the stories are not supposed to be told at all times of the year. So he was cautioning some of the storytellers. There was a rise in Native American stories as collective wisdom, and he made a very passionate and I think very intelligent plea for people to sort of clean up their act and to do more research to find out where those stories and where those songs emanated from, and to honor the tradition.
There is great power in collective tradition and ancient knowledge, but you really need to respect it and honor it. I was going back to the Black influences in music and things. A couple of weeks ago, I was pondering this very subject, and I started to think about my own musical playing. I play bottleneck slide. Black blues tradition came from the diddley stick. I do a finger style that is a Piedmont style blues. I stole most of my licks from Mississippi John Hurt, Man Slips. Most of what I do, I can trace back to a Black source, one way or another. It has had such an incredible impact on culture in our country. And I'm delighted to see that we're finally recognizing that and acknowledging that to some degree.
Well, it's so...
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, the whole question of appropriation is that music, the arts, they're going to speak to us. They're going to appeal to something, regardless of where we come from. And so it's not that those sources shouldn't be used and shouldn't become part of our expression. It's just, as you say, to attribute and give credence to where they come from. And then I think even more important, to find in your own self where the authentic piece of yourself can add to what that piece is. And, certainly, if you feel the blues, play the blues. Well,
I'd like to close out with one last question. Now, I know that, in your work connecting different groups of people through music, you must have had some truly powerful moments. Hickory Hill is obviously one of those. I'm wondering if you maybe could share one final favorite moment with us.
Well, I tell you, one of the most powerful moments that I felt using music was in 2015. My organization, the Living Legacy Project, we put on a conference in Birmingham, Alabama, at the same time that we were all commemorating the 50th anniversary of Bloody Sunday, of that march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And on that Sunday, we took 6 buses of people, about 600 people, to a place in down the road in Montgomery. And it was a place where they had stopped for the last night on the march from Selma to Montgomery. And we had breakfast there. And at the end of breakfast, we had just a brief ceremony to celebrate the fact that we were now going to go up the road and walk across that bridge with 70,000 people.
Wow.
And I will tell you that as we rose to leave, I was privileged to start singing "We Shall Overcome." And in that moment, with people of so many different backgrounds, singing that song and then leaving there and going to march across that bridge, and we sang all the way across the bridge. I will never, ever forget that moment.
Wow.
As, we sang those songs that the people had sung in places like Brown Chapel and First Baptist Church in Selma. And we sang voices, 70,000 people all around us singing, marching in one direction, saying, we're together. And this time across the bridge, we are going to look into the future and make sure that our lives celebrate our opportunity to be together. And I think we were actually singing Wade in the Water as we walked.
Not even a little surprised. Well, Reggie, this has been a delightful evening. I've enjoyed your performance so much and really especially enjoyed visiting with you. I want to thank you so much and hope that, well, we'll be visiting one another here in about 3 weeks at Hickory Hill.
Yeah, we will.
So thank you so much for being with us, and we'll call it a night and see folks next time.